Hello, and welcome to the Columbus Metropolitan Club. I'm Steve Marks, Chair of the CMC Board of Directors and President of Hannah News Service here in Columbus. When I say this, I truly mean it. It is great to see people back in this room, so thank you. And this is a sold-out crowd today. Over the past several weeks, in response to the tragic death of George Floyd, communities have expressed shock and pain. Racism is being acknowledged as never before, and there seems to be strong momentum for real change. In our longstanding tradition, and for as long as it takes, CMC will work to develop forums that provide community space to explore these issues in our new series, Racism, Where Do We Go From Here? Today's forum, Racism, a Public Health Crisis, is live streamed thanks to our live stream partners, WOSU Public Media, Dispatch Media Group, and PNC. We'd also like to thank all of you who purchased a virtual seat today. We are very grateful for this support and are able to continue live streaming services in large part because of you. Thank you very much. On May 19th, when Franklin County Commissioners declared that racism is a public health crisis, they probably didn't foresee the protests that erupted in our community nationwide and around the world shortly thereafter. Complicated and complex, the issue of racism became urgent. People of all colors and backgrounds are engaged in a demand for greater equity and justice. How does declaring racism a public health crisis generate new policies and change culture? Well, we are pleased to welcome two leaders at the forefront of this issue, Franklin County Commissioner Kevin Boyce and Columbus City Council member Priscilla Tyson. Joe Ingles of the Statehouse News Bureau will host the conversation. Joe, we look forward to the conversation.
Well, thank you so much, first of all, for letting me host the CMC again. It's always a great time. This is an important conversation, and I know we need to keep some brevity here, so I'm just going to start out with the very first question. When we talk about racism as a public health crisis, what are we talking about? What does that mean? And you can go ahead, whichever one wants to tackle it first. Go ahead.
Go first? Okay. First of all, let me say thank you so much for having me today, and it's so good to see so many wonderful and friendly faces. I feel like I haven't been in one of these in a long, long time. I will correct you on one thing. It would be inaccurate to say that I was the leader from the Franklin County Commission standpoint. My colleague Marilyn Brown is here, and my other colleague John O'Grady have been very active and engaged participants as well as idealists around this conversation. So let me just give you the nutshell of where Franklin County came to this conclusion. In 2018, we started to ask ourselves as a Board of Commission, what were the issues that were driving the growth of poverty in Central Ohio? We became the largest county in Ohio, and what we were seeing, and by all accounts and measures, we're one of the more prosperous counties. And we were seeing growth in nearly every category. Our unemployment rate was at an all-time low, and you can see there was a crane in the sky in nearly every part of town in Central Ohio. Yet we were also seeing poverty growing in a very significant way. And we did heat maps to really illustrate the patterns of growth of poverty. When we started to peel back the layers, and we spent the better part of a year meeting with, and this wasn't staff or just the consultants, the three commissioners, we were there for every meeting, rolling up our sleeves, going back and forth. But when we started to peel back the layers, I'll make this short, what we saw embedded in nearly every category was of measuring quality of life, affordable housing, access to quality health care, access to good education, all of these social determinants of health. The underlying and consistent element that we saw was racism. And this is not just, the county commissioners, we kind of just looked at the data and we said, we had hired advisors to help us think through and really peel back these layers and evaluate and assess this. And so this is what the data told us. This is what the research illustrated. And so from there, after we finished our review of this poverty element, we saw two things. One, we have to address poverty in its broad spectrum and way. But two, it wouldn't make a difference in everything that we wanted to do around poverty reduction if we weren't willing to address race. And so that became the impetus to the declaration that at the core and the heart of our work in poverty, in inequalities, was this issue of race being unaddressed, being a very divisive issue, and being something that as a county, we just hadn't taken on directly. And so the declaration, I'll say this and conclude, the declaration, while we were living in a pandemic in 2020, a global pandemic, we realized in 2018 that there was a pandemic before the pandemic. And if there's not a day goes by that I'm not reminded that I'm an African-American male in American society. Yet that plays out in nearly every statistical category that you can think of. If you name it, it plays out in that. And so that's what our effort was really about. That is why we felt, being the largest county in Ohio and one of the largest in the nation, that our declaration would send a signal and would also ignite a conversation that would be worthy of with the work that we're doing and to help us move the needle in that category.
Mm-hmm. Ms. Tyson, what about at the city level?
So first of all, I want to thank the CMC for hosting this today. And I also want to recognize the work of the commissioners because, of course, Columbus is in Franklin County. So any of the data that they have certainly reflects what's going on in Columbus, Ohio. So as the chair of Health and Human Services for the city of Columbus, certainly when I look at those areas of who we fund in Health and Human Services, all the nonprofit, a lot of the nonprofit organizations, as well as the Community Shelter Board, as well as when you're thinking about health, we have, every April we celebrate Minority Health Month, and we look at all the statistics of what's going on with African Americans or Black people in the city of Columbus. And so based upon that, based upon just understanding if we're going to make a change in regards to how we move people, because we're talking about people in poverty, we're talking about people who are generally going to those social service agencies. How do you move them forward? And when you realize, as Kevin has just stated, it really does become racism. Racism is the core of this. And so when you think about on June 1st, my council colleagues support the resolution declaring racism as a public health crisis. And I'm so thankful that they all supported this resolution. It is really important to have that declaration. And I have certainly heard from people, well, what does that mean? A declaration without action, what does that mean? Well, let me say what this means. The declaration means something. It means you are drawing a line in the sand, that you are declaring that racism is a public health issue. And I will share with you that everyone doesn't believe that, because before you can change something, you have to recognize there is a problem. And if you don't acknowledge that, nothing changes. And so, I say Kevin, but Commissioner Boyce and I had the.
Just call me Your Honor.
Your Honor, Your Honor, Your Honor, Your Majesty.
Yeah.
So was it last week? So this issue was so important that I had said to Joe that I really have not been out because of COVID. I have stayed in my house because I certainly have health concerns, and so does my family. And so I have not been out. Last week, we were both at the Statehouse to testify for Senator Craig and Senator Smith to testify that, so the state wants to have a resolution declaring race as a public health crisis. And when we were in that room, I just want to share that certainly people were having their heads down, not necessarily paying attention, as well as that is the same room that each of you heard that from Senator Huffman that stated that, use the words, coloreds are getting COVID, the reason they're getting COVID is because they're not washing their hands and wearing masks. So why this is so important is that if you don't declare it, you will not do anything to change it. And because of us having this resolution, for me, it's about sharing how you live and how you die in our cities. how you live and how you die. And it also, and that is your quality of life. So the numbers are clear. We can give you lots of statistics about life expectancy. The life expectancy between blacks and the white community is different. I can give you statistics. We know the infant mortality. We know the numbers. And what is the area that is focused on is race. And that is why I'll mention this last point on this. So we got here also because there's federal, state, regional, and local electeds have also played a role in this inequality, but not doing certain things. And now we have the opportunity. We have the opportunity to change how people live in Columbus and in Central Ohio. And because of that, other cities are doing the same thing. The last comment I'll make is I'm very appreciative that this resolution, we received a letter from over 1,000 for-profit, nonprofit business leaders in this community supporting race as a public health crisis. And I've been watching, looking at the newspaper, getting feedback, and they are making changes. So it does matter, and just that declaration.
One of the things that I've noticed is that recently, I live in the suburbs, and the suburban area where I live, I've noticed that they have had protests, that there are Black Lives Matter signs in front of homes in Powell, Ohio right now. Delaware County, which is one of the reddest counties in the state, there are a lot of people who are coming out to these events, a lot of people who are voicing things on social media, saying that they're getting it. They didn't realize what was going on, but they understand now. And so, from my point of the world, things look different. But what about you guys? You've been around here for a while, Commissioner and Councilwoman. What do you think? Is this different, or is it just different window dressing? I don't want to call it that, but is it just a different look? Is there a real difference here?
Well, want me to go first?
That's fine.
Or you can go first. You can let you.
All right. I do think this time is different, but I don't want to minimize the past times when, we looked at how looking at the civil rights movement and how that started, and here we are, if you think about 1968, we're now at 2000 and 2020, and look, we're still talking about the same issues. We're still seeing people of color having a less quality of life. Yes, you may see more people like positions like Kevin and I are in, that maybe that wasn't the case then, but let me be very clear that those issues, so we had more protests and march before. I think now the difference today is that people are seeing it. You can't really hide from it. The other difference is, I do believe, especially in a city like Columbus, why I think when I was saying the declaration, people are having action, is that most people now know someone that is different than them. They even now have individuals in families that now have Black children that, your grandchild, so maybe, if you were someone whose grandchild is now Black, you now have a different view of that. So I do believe by seeing this on television, you can't hide away from what happened to Mr. Floyd. And that, I believe, and these declarations and research Now is the time to do something. And if we don't do something now, we will lose this opportunity and things will go back to the way they used to be. So it is important as we move forward that everybody gets under this umbrella and says this is not the way we want to live in Columbus, Ohio. We see it. What can we do to participate? What action can we take to change the trajectory of people's lives in Columbus, Ohio?
Let me start with, Joe, your observation about your own community. I think that the masses are speaking out. I think that everyone is tired of the scenes that have played out in the media over the last several years. Here's the stark reality about this, though. Eric Garner, George Floyd, Trayvon Martin, these are cases that have been high profile in the media over the last couple of years. But the fact of the matter is these kinds of things have been happening for a long time. The difference or the nuance is technology. Today, there is a camera on every corner, on every phone. Every 5-year-old walking down the street has an iPhone. And so today, the narrative has changed around reality versus talk in conversation. Now, it's hard to dispute. Watching the George Floyd tape, it's hard to dispute a video with audio, real time. You know, it's hard to dispute that action. So that's the first part. I believe that the masses are speaking, and I do believe that what you're seeing is a new chapter. But I'm also reminded of a time when I was in college. I think I was somewhere early college or mid-college when the Rodney King scenario played out. And I remember a very similar environment. In fact, I would say that year, I think it was around 92 or something, but I say that year it was even more volatile. You know, it was just happened to be caught on tape. And, you know, so you didn't have the sort of buildup, if you will, of video cameras and high profile stories. But I will say, I remember it felt like something was going to change. It felt like people were waking up. But I also recognized the division that was also clear, in that how some people felt a certain way about it and other people felt another way. It's the same today. You know, as Councilmember Tyson talked about, just go and watch on any given day the legislature operate. You know, we're there testifying on the bill in the Senate for the declaration of racism as a public health crisis. But then the following day was even more interesting discussion in the legislature. They were discussing whether or not to ban Confederate flags at county fairs. And I encourage you to go on the Ohio channel and watch the tapes, because what you'll see is a clear contrast in ideology. And that ideology doesn't just exist in the Ohio legislature. It exists all over America. And so, yes, I believe that a new chapter is starting for America, and certainly here Franklin County will do the best we can. But I also believe that we've got a long way to go, because that ideology, even in high places in our land, and I won't start a political fight here, but even in high places in our land, there is a divisiveness that continues to permeate American policy today. And then the final thing I'll say is that, you know, we can't legislate morality. We can do all that we can as elected officials from a policy implementation standpoint, and we'll do that. We've been fighting for these issues for a long time. The truth of the matter is we're talking about Civilian Review Board for the City of Columbus and body cameras. Well, we were talking about that 20 years ago. We were talking about body cameras 10 years ago, you know, and here we are, you know, still fighting for these changes, these things, you know, but you can't legislate morality. At the end of the day, what's going to move the needle and change this conversation around racism is you. And you as individuals. It starts with you accepting certain responsibilities in your own home, in your own life, in your own circle of friends and whatnot. And then from there, we can begin to build something around a real conversation of eliminating racism altogether. And I really believe this, I'll end with this, that the group of us now that live in this generation, I believe a new chapter is starting in America. But will we see the end result of that. I believe that the end result of the true commitment and work and change that we do today, we'll probably realize 50 years from now or even longer. But that's all the more reason for us to invest in this work today, so that my grandchildren, which I don't have any yet, but my grandchildren are not dealing with the same battles and the same scars that we are dealing with and that we are fighting against. And so, the notion that our elected officials are the ones that are going to change this conversation and move in a policy, that a law that is created or a resolution is going to do that's one piece of the puzzle that makes up this entire mosaic of life. And that's really what the challenge now is. It's not what will Councilmember Tyson do or Commissioner Brown do or Commissioner Boyce. It's what you will do with us.
Now, when you say that, though, are you talking about, it kind of feels like you're alluding to what will happen in November, or what will happen politically. Is that where do you think that we're going to see some kind of effect in the November election because of what we're seeing right now?
You directed to me?
Well, I'll let you follow up on it because you were kind of talking about that.
Well, yes. The answer is yes. That I think that this November, just like November 4 years ago, gave an indication of some concerns about this country. I think if you're a person who believes that the election of Barack Obama didn't sort of bring this question to rise up, because you've got, and then the subsequent election of Donald Trump, that has fueled even more divisiveness in this country that I think we're hoping it reconciles itself in favor of the masses in November. But that absolutely is the question. And I absolutely believe it is a line in the sand on this issue. And I know that sounds hardcore, but that's the environment we live in. We've been protesting for 2-3 weeks now, all across the country. All across the country. And that is something that suggests that the masses have arisen and are taking note, and I hope to goodness that it plays out in the right way in November.
And I would agree. We have to vote. Something that you can do is make sure people are registered to vote and that they go out and vote. You also can make sure that you're having conversations with your friends and families and colleagues about racism and inequality. You have a responsibility to do this. Speak up privately and publicly about racial inequities. And use privilege. Use your privilege to be able to make change occur. People, in our community, we have people whose voices aren't heard, not the way that they should be heard. Their issues may not be being addressed as they should be addressed. And so we as a collective body have to address those issues. Yes, each of us plays a role. You can't say it's just the electeds. We certainly can't say it's just the business leaders. And everybody has a role to play if we're going to turn this around. And think about, racism has been an issue for over 400 years. You have to, and so part of moving forward is really understanding how we got here. How we got here. And if you think about chattel slavery, Black people didn't come here on their own. And Black people didn't come here as being viewed as equal. They came here to work. They came as slaves. Look at the history moving to the civil rights movement, and look at today. And we're still dealing with these inequalities. So you have to know the history of how we got here and how do we move forward. And each of us has a significant role to play in it. Thank you.
That leads to another one of my questions, which is the history and the dialogue. It seems like this is an opportunity to talk to within your family, within your friend group, about the history and talk about, how does this affect everyone? Do you see it as that? And if so, what advice or how would you form that discussion so that it's a productive discussion and you actually learn something from it?
Well, how you form that discussion, I think that is, and I have lots of, there's videos, documentaries, there's books to understand how we got here. I remember when we had the speaker from The Color of Law was here at the Columbus Metropolitan Club. And so when you look at how our laws for things like, let's look at redlining, you know, do you think that Black people just decided to just all live in the same community? That it was just their choice? No, that was just not their choice. It happened because there were laws that did not allow Black people and white people to live in the same communities. When those laws began to change, and Black people were able to move in other communities, then the Caucasians, white people moved out of the communities. And then they lowered they lowered the values of the property. And so, but also there were times where Black people couldn't buy a house. And you know what? The way you build wealth, the way people really build wealth, is home ownership is a significant way that people build wealth. And if you could not buy a house, then you didn't have the same opportunities to build wealth. And then we can talk about lending policies. I mean, there's a lot of things that have certainly not helped Black Americans move forward. The education system. The education has always been the way to move forward. We all know that. But everyone doesn't have equal access and all the services they need in our educational system. There were policies around that. So we look at Brown versus the Board of Education. You have to just research what really happened, you know, after that. So I think that there's lots of materials I can certainly share. I mean, even the book from Michelle Alexander, The New Jim Crow. It's just getting an understanding. And then once you have an understanding, begin to then ask questions, have conversations about how do we move forward. The other way, I don't know if this is, and I want to just, there are some, based upon this conversation, by this declaration in our city, there are some things that are happening. So I think on June the 12th, Kurt Walker from Nationwide, he declared $1 million to support the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. He's also going to be they're supporting the local NAACP. They're also focused on the project, I think it's called Bailout, dealing with the bail system in the United States. And I use that example. I'm going to use another example. So Dr. Drake just said we're going to spend $1 million on the OSU's campus to focus on racism. And just today, I don't know if anyone had the opportunity to see this, but just today, Netflix committed $120 million to Morehouse, Spelman, and the United Negro College Fund. They initially said they were going to give $20 million. They met with the students on campus. They said that wasn't enough. They're giving $140 million. Because the way you move forward, the way we move forward is education. It's one of the significant ways. And that education will allow young Black and brown people to move forward. And so what Netflix is doing, which is great, that CEO, is that him stepping up, that's the largest gift from a private donor, will also be the impetus for other people to be able to give. And that's what I'm talking about as real action. But you can also join the Urban League and the NAACP right here in Columbus, Ohio, and get to know and understand that history. So there's many things that we can do individually, and there's certainly things that our corporate partners can do, and to be able to real action that are things that move us forward, and also pay our women, Black women, the equal pay as they're paying white men.
And just before you answer that as well, Commissioner Boyce, I just want to let everyone know that we'll move to the questions from our audience in just a few minutes. We hope to have some live questions here, and we will have some from our live stream audience as well. But I'm going to go ahead and let Commissioner Boyce weigh in on that answer on that question.
One, let me say that I'm deferring all my questions to Councilmember Tyson, so she'll be answering questions for
Smart
me.
man.
You should know that. And then two, it's just interesting looking over the crowd, and because you have the mask on, I can't really see your faces, so I can't see your reactions to anything. So that's a different kind of experience talking. Just a little side note. So two things that I would say to answer that question. How do we talk about this and change and whatnot? And let me share something. How many people in this room have ever played the game Monopoly? By a show of hands. So everybody. Okay, so there's this professor at North Carolina A&T who does this project. So her students come in. I'm going to paraphrase this for time's sake. I know Commissioner Brown knows this too. But she's a professor at North Carolina A&T, and she teaches a class on racism and how people are affected and how systemic impacts of it. And so first day of class, kids show up, and so let's call it 30 kids show up to class. And so she says, all right, first thing we're going to do is, she says, who's all played Monopoly? Of course, everyone raised their hands. She said, all right, we're going to break you up into 3 groups of 10. 1, 2, 3. So the first group, we're going to let you start playing the game of Monopoly. So the first group they pick their thimble and the hat and the car, and they begin to play the game of Monopoly. So she lets them play for about an hour. And what's happened? They've gone around the board, they've started to collect $200 and started to purchase property. So an hour goes by of them doing this. And then she invites the second group of 10 to join the game. They pick their pieces, what's left, and they join the game. They go around the board and begin to collect property, collect $200, collect property. Another hour, so that's 2 hours now that have gone by. What do you think's happened at this point? All the property has been purchased and most of the wealth has been distributed. So then she invites the third group to join in on the Monopoly game. And so at this point, there are no more pieces left. People are literally pulling pieces of lint out of their pocket or things from the floor. All they're doing is either getting their $200, paying rent because they're landing on someone else's property, or landing in jail. The odds are just not for them at this point because, A, the wealth has been distributed and the rules of the game have been set, and you're not a part of it. And she concludes the class by saying, that's what it's like to experience racism in America. That's what it's like being Black in America. The rules of the game have been set, the wealth has been distributed, and you weren't a part of either. Now catch up with us. And then there's this sort of outlier where every now and then somebody goes bankrupt, and one of the third group, they get to land on a property and buy a property. And so it looks like there's progress. Oh my gosh, someone has made it from the third group into owning property and developing wealth. But it's not systemic. The systemic elements of the existence of this game still favor the first 10, and then to some extent the second 10. And so I just maybe that to me is the best description of the conversation around what it's like to experience racism in America. And then the final thing I'll say, and it goes back to, and I want to begin to take questions. In fact, forget it. We'll just take questions and I'll just answer.
Go ahead and finish your thought.
Okay.
Yeah,
So my final point is this, that the conversation around the public health crisis, because I don't want you to confuse the idea of the Declaration and the meaningful power of that with the things that these real health issues. And so when you look at nearly every category of measurement of quality of life and health, you will find African Americans at the very bottom. Hypertension, diabetes, obesity, other chronic illnesses. I could go down the list, and it is consistent across the board. Embedded in that goes to what Councilmember Tyson was saying. It's where you live, access to public transportation, access to grocery stores, access to employment. All of those things become factors in maintaining the current status that you are, which is already on the bottom rung of that category. And so if you want to get statistical about it, until we sort of really peel back the layers to say that we're going to build grocery stores in certain areas, we're going to make sure that there's medical care in certain areas, we're going to make sure affordable housing exists. And Commissioner Brown recently championed an initiative to make sure we're expanding some areas at Easton, and she led the assurance that there would be affordable or workforce housing. So that if you work at Easton, can you live at Easton? Probably not. And so, the idea was there should be housing for folks that work there so that they can afford transportation, or they can get to work on time, or they can, access other services and resources. And so it's that kind of policy thinking that helps us peel back these statistical layers. And that's kind of where this conversation is headed beyond the resolution.
Okay. Well, very good. It's CMC's tradition to take audience questions. Jane Scott, CMC's president, is back there, and she's going to be curating questions from the live stream audience. If you're here in the audience, please remember to keep your microphone time to the question. And we thank you for avoiding long editorial comments. So, Jane, what's our first question? Okay, well, come on up and ask your first question, state your name, and tell us what you'd like to hear.
Thank you. My name is Kathy Fox. I'm with Community Strategy Partners. And my question for our two guests is, what specific local policies do you want to see implemented that the audience today can help you with? Ask of us, how can we help you with specific policies that you'd like to see changed?
Let me go first.
Who wants that one?
I'll go first.
Okay.
Well, first of all, thank you, Kathy, for that question. I'd start here. The first part is that there is no magic wand or formula to addressing these issues. I don't have a playbook that will take us out of this, and so let me just start there. But what we do have is we've created an innovation center. And the idea around the innovation center, or hub, whatever you want to call it, is to facilitate ideas and things that will move the needle in poverty reduction, in racism elimination. And so I think over the next year or so, the idea is that this center will allow for organizations like yours and many others to help us think through what are these policy changes that need to occur, and develop them, pilot them, test them, and replicate them in a way that is meaningful for the broader community and society. And that's really exciting. That is new, that is big, and that is untouched and undone. And we're the first to do that, not bragging about it, but to say that that's how serious we are about this work. And I had one other point I was going to make about that. I know. So you asked, like, what policies? There are policies that we're doing. The city is taking on a number of measures that deal with law enforcement right now. That's kind of the thing, if you will. The spotlight is on law enforcement and things that will protect us. But Commissioner Brown and I and Commissioner O'Grady, we've been talking about things that are more systemic and unseen. Zoning changes. I won't go into the details, but we had a zoning recently where it was a certain type of business in a certain kind of area, and we really dug in on this issue to ensure that that particular establishment that was going there, or was it a certain type of establishment that was going there? I won't get into details, but it's that kind of action, policy-wise, that makes the difference. And so that when you go to certain neighborhoods and all you see is drug corner stores, with the liquor stores, and check cashing places, and all of these things that tend to prey on our most vulnerable. Looking at policies that prevent that, limit that, or even mitigate what exists.
Can I just share? I think that from the city's perspective, we are certainly looking at policies and recommendations. And so just yesterday, we were all asked prior to yesterday to have an individual sit on what's called the Chief Quinlan's Advisory Panel. So for the next 3 years to be able to advise the chief on policies that affect our community. And certainly we're looking at the disparities between how black people and black and brown people are treated in the community, what kind of policies can we make so that everyone feels safe. In certain communities, some people feel safe. In certain communities, it's not like the police are protecting them, us. And so I think that's enough. That's one. We just from public health, we now have the Center for Public Health Innovation that's focused on racial inequities, from the mayor and Dr. Mashika Roberts. From City Council, and I see one of our commissioners are here, is Jennifer Peterson. We will be releasing the report next month on the Commission on Black Girls, and so even though we're certainly talking about this issue, but we have just drilled down to what's going on with the black women, and so how do we support black girls early. We've also looking at different policies around minority and small business, and making sure that we're asking all these questions about how does that affect black and brown people? Are they getting contracts? How do we, so everything now we're looking at, we not that we haven't, but now more intently from a racial lens to make sure that everyone has a stronger opportunity to move forward in our community. And the disparity study was key. It's basically said women and minorities are not getting business in the city of Columbus. So that means we got to do something differently in the city of Columbus.
Okay, next question, please.
Good afternoon. My name is Doreen Whitley Rogers. I am with a company called Esri that uses geospatial information technologies and location intelligence to solve big problems in government. My question aligns with this conversation around policy, understanding that the programs and things that you've mentioned are in an effort to sort of level the playing field, as Commissioner Boyce alluded to with the monopoly analogy. But what are some big, bold changes that you think both the city and the county needs to do in addition to funding programs, but that really get to the root cause of infrastructure and allocation of funding between different departments? What are your thoughts on big, bold, root cause infrastructure changes that we can make and that we can support as citizens?
Well, a couple of things. I would first say, first of all, share your ideas. And because we work for you, so we want to hear your ideas, because we don't have all the answers. But we also, I think, we are having we're doing a lot of work now around safety. And we had a community safety commission that worked for about 18 months that certainly stated ways that we can change recruitment, training, looking at how we look at the interaction between police and community, how do we look at the policies differently. So that's one major change that I think you will see from the city of Columbus. You also even having a civilian review board that will happen by the end of the year. That is a bold step for the city of Columbus. And so, but what is happening now is that based upon lots of studies, now it's time to take policy actions on these issues, and we certainly will be looking at other issues, like I just mentioned, the Center for Public Health Innovation. What do we need to do differently in policy around healthcare?
Thank you for the question. Is it Dorian? So one, we work with your organization because, what I think it's the same organization that works with GIS systems from across the country. So I work with the Gates Foundation on an economic mobility project with NACO. And you all have been very much a part of helping us take data that we already collect through our GIS system and use it to plan, to strategize, and to develop tactical approaches to addressing whatever issues that are on the table. So your work is critical, and we're very engaged. I've got a meeting, I think, coming up with you all and our county data people at the auditor's office. So looking forward to that. Here's where I think, I mean, again, we're kind of got this moment in time, we got to say something really interesting so that you'll like it. I mean, that's what, that's how it works, right? But I'm going to deviate from that. Where I think we should start, and this is what we've learned as a county in terms of how we're getting at racism, I think that we should implement the racism, how's the class called? The racial equity class that we all took as commissioners. We had our entire BOC participate and take a racial equity class over the course of 2 days. And I think that curriculum should be implemented in our school system. And I think that we should begin to sort of talk about history in not in the way we wanted history to look for America, but in the actual way that it played out. And so these conversations about removing the Christopher Columbus statue and things of that nature, those are real and legitimate conversations that it's time to have and begin to tell the story about Christopher Columbus and about, I mean, the facts are there in the history book. We've just chosen to tell it in a certain way that isn't accurate, isn't an accurate depiction of the role that Christopher Columbus played in America. If you don't believe me, you just do research and figure it out. And so from my standpoint, until we can get at the truth, and sometimes the truth can be painful, until we can get at that, I think, to me, that's where I want to start with the policy changes. And I want to go back to one thing that Councilmember Tyson was talking about, and that's the contributions of some of the corporate citizens and corporate agencies. I'm grateful for those things, and I'm glad she brought up the Netflix contribution, because what I struggle with, and I struggle with this as a commissioner, quite frankly, as well as I struggle in watching this play out. We got to get past these gratuitous designations of, everyone wants to do $1 million because it sounds like something that's going to get a headline and get response. Well, $1 million isn't a lot in the big scheme of things that we're talking about in terms of change. If you're going to really move the needle, if you're going to really illustrate a commitment and demonstration to progress, then you're going to commit $100 million like Netflix did. And you're going to say, you know what, we are in it for the long haul. We are going to dig deep, and we're going to feel it a little bit. And you go with these institutions of higher learning, which are critical in this conversation. And I could, who's here from OSU? Anybody here from OSU? All right, I'm going to talk about you real bad for a second here. OSU, which I'm a Buckeye fan through and through. I'm born and raised right here in Columbus. But the standards to get into OSU today have become an exclusive institution. We're working so hard to compete with Michigan and other schools that we won't compete with in the big scheme of things, and that we've changed the dynamic of who can go to Ohio State. And that there is a racial element to that. And that's why this conversation around racial equities, it's got to play out, and it's going to be a little painful, and it's going to be a little sore. She's walking up to the microphone now. I'm in trouble. Here she comes. But my point is, these are the tough conversations we've got to have right here in Central Ohio, or we're not, to Councilmember Tyson's point, if we don't get at the education and peel back those layers and really get at these policy changes that you're asking about, then this work and this moment we will have lost on bad time.
And I know we're trying to move this, but the policy around, around who in our community, if you look at who is in the homeless shelter, who's being evicted, who's making the 60 cents on the dollar, who's having their babies die 2.5 times more. Look, those are black women in this community. And we cannot be afraid to be able to speak truth to power in terms of how we make change is about saying, here's what's going on. We're not going to say, try to hide and call it what it's not. That is it. And that's why when I'm saying the Commission on Black Girls, because if you're going to change the trajectory of Black women in this community, besides the work that we're doing with nonprofits now, you have got to focus on our girls. And so making sure that they have everything that they need to be able to move forward so they're not going to be in the same, we're not sitting, well, I won't be sitting here probably 20 years from now, but for those who are sitting here 20 years from now, I would not want us to be in the same situation we are in today. That would be absolutely unacceptable, and that means there are going to have to be policy changes to be able to help our girls. Our girls are being suspended 5 to 6 times more than anyone else. So I can go on and on and on about what's happening to them as to why women and most of our kids live with single family houses by their mothers. So there is some work to be done. There's some policies that have to be changed, and we all have to, once we come to you and say, here's what we want to do. We need your support to chime in and help us to help our community to move forward on those areas that we know are critically important, people that are critically important, that we have not addressed their issues.
And real quickly to Jane with a question from the live stream.
I have a lot of questions, so I'm going to ask questions. We're not going to get through them all, but I'm going to ask questions that have not been covered yet. So this is from Tina Alexander, Ohio State University. It's been difficult for me to talk with my white colleagues about equity versus equality. Could one of the panelists talk about the differences and how can I communicate that with people who are not of color?
Again, so I can speak to it, and I'm sure Kevin can too, because I'm on a committee called Race, Equity, and Leadership at the National League of Cities, and I've chaired that committee. So equality is that everybody's getting the exact same, you know. So if, let me see this. So let's just say that, let's just say this is a fence line. And a fence line, you have, and you want to see over the fence. Well, there may be someone who can already see over the fence and see the baseball game because they're already tall enough. And if you put everybody, no matter, so someone is tall, someone's a little shorter, and someone's a little shorter. So for everybody to be able to see the game, if we said, okay, everyone just stand up and see it. Well, everybody can't, if everybody's supposed to see it based upon their height, they could not see over the fence line. So they can't see the game. So equity is, what do we need to do to make sure everybody can see the game? So the person that's next to the person that's tallest will maybe stand on, maybe just one step to be able to see over. The next person, so they need a little help so that they can have that equity. The next person may need to have 3 steps to be able to see. That's what we're talking about. So when we want to so the word equality, that means everybody's having the same. And that is, we can't be at a place where everyone's at the same, because we're not all the same. And so we have to then provide resources and policies to make sure that everyone has an chance to be able to live their best quality of life. And that is what equity is all about.
What she said. I'm going to go with that answer. It's a good answer.
Okay. One real quick question.
Yes. My name's Ronell Tomlinson. I work in state government, and I'll just first state very quickly, I woke up this morning to a song that was in my head by Stevie Wonder that was titled Heaven Help Us All. And during the course of the night, I kept dreaming and hearing this song, and I know that it's having a huge impact upon me emotionally. And then as I'm sitting at the table, I'm thinking about Lonnie Grenier's book, Tyranny of the Majority. And I think back to 1994, when President Clinton was trying to nominate her for a position. And you sit back and go, people rejected Lonnie Grenier because she had the audacity to talk about the majority. If we don't enlist the majority to understand that it's not only my history, but it's our history, and if they don't go back and revisit this stuff, then we're going to be right back where we were. Because the song Heaven Help Us All back in 1970 is still present today in terms of what we're doing today. And I don't want to spend time talking about how we can maybe make some changes, because public education, Waco, Texas is where I grew up. We didn't integrate until 1972 because I was a child in 1972 and I got bused to schools. I just looked up the history of Columbus. Brown versus Board again in 1954. But public school education was not integrated until 1979. So the deal is that, folks, you can pass laws and so forth, but if we as the majority of individuals do not come together, and how do we come together to move this pendulum and never ever once again say we become complacent with the way things are? Because that complacency of always thinking that everything's okay, because I haven't looked outside of myself. So how do we get people to look outside of their own selves when it's not directly impacting them, to take up this mantle and do something about it?
I mean, I think that's what I was saying earlier when I say it really comes down to you as an individual. I mean, we've got to begin to change. There is no way to legislate morality, you know. We've got work to do to develop comfort with one another. We've got work to do to create cultural competency so that we understand certain elements and ways to interact in certain communities, and things that can be offensive, things that are complementary. And so there is no simple answer to that question, you know, and I would also say we've got a long ways to go. That being said, I maybe throw that question back to you as individuals and say, at what point do you say, I'm going to move the needle in this conversation about racism? It's going to start in my household, it's going to start in my community, it's going to start in my city or state, and I'm going to be a part of it. And it means stepping out of the comfort zone, being able to absorb criticism and learn as you go.
And I'll just add this, it really does start with you. Everyone has seen what's going on. We know that racism exists. It's existed for a very, very long time. We know it. Sometimes you try to act like it doesn't happen because you can actually live in places, and if you don't watch television, don't even have to deal with it. But it exists. And I know it's very difficult for some people to relate to it because it's not how they live their lives each and every day. But I will tell you, as a Black woman, I absolutely have experienced racism. I'm a mother of 4 sons who's absolutely experienced racism, who absolutely is concerned about, can they go to a park without someone saying they're trying to attack them? Can they drive their car? And if they're stopped by police, every Black mother or father has told their child what to do if the police stops them. Keep your hands here. Don't say anything. Do exactly what they tell you. Don't move. Every Black family has told their children that. I can't state that, and I know that if I talk to, white counterparts, they're not having that same conversation. When you think about, Kevin didn't mention her name because I'm going to mention Breonna Taylor in Louisville, who the police did a no-knock on the wrong house and end up shooting an EMT 8 times. So when you have, we can certainly share with you what it feels like to experience racism. But you have to also care enough about this entire community and everyone to be able to be willing to say, I want to learn more and I want to do my part to make sure that we don't continue to stay in the place that we're in today. And if people don't do that, we can only do so much, but it requires each and every one of us to participate and move our community forward. It isn't just a Black issue. It isn't just a white issue. It's a community issue. And if you want this community to move forward and to be the best that it can be, it has to make sure that equity is here for everyone to be able to move our city, our county, our community forward.
Thank you.
I hope you were able to pull out of today's forum as much as I did. It's clear that all of us in this room have a certain amount of privilege we should be using to work and address this issue. And so I thank the speakers. But we hope you tune in next Wednesday at noon online or in person at the Boathouse as we feature Play On Patrick, Andrew Pierce, and Michael Bivin III for Black Youth Speak in our series, Racism, Where Do We Go From Here? We are grateful for our live stream partners, WOSU Media, Public Media, PNC, the Dispatch Media Group, and our online virtual seat patrons. Thank you very much. And we want to give special thanks to our speakers, Councilwoman Tyson, Commissioner Boyce, and of course, Joe Ingles. Thank you all. We hope to see you in person soon.